hand over to Nikki to do our welcome while I'm getting the slides up.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nikki Glassbrook, so I'm a public health specialist based at Devon County Council, and along with Natalie, who you can see on the screen, we lead on suicide prevention for Devon County Council. And that really means that we have we facilitate a multi-agency group that meets about 3 or 4 times a year, and we're also responsible for writing an action plan. But we'll go into that in a bit more detail as part of our presentation. So Rebecca has asked us to talk to you about suicide prevention this afternoon. And Natalie will start giving you some context around that. But I know that, you know, whilst I appreciate that you probably are used to having difficult conversations, working with difficult situations, I just want to stress that one of the things around, so I have never, ever been to a meeting to talk about suicide without somebody coming up to me afterwards and saying that they've either been affected by a suicide of somebody they know, or they have at one time in their lives felt suicidal or attempted suicide. So I think, you know, even though it's a very rare act, it's something that is sometimes, you know, affects a lot of people. So I'm just, you know, asking you to be mindful about your own well-being. If anything is triggering or disturbing with you, just please take time out, take time to look after your own well-being, and we will be putting up some signposting things at the end of the lecture, but just to be mindful of that.
Thanks, Nikki. So we'll move in. I know that people are probably still joining, but this is a 90-minute session, so with a few things to cover. Because there's so many of us on the call, which is brilliant, it's fantastic to see so many people interested and joining us this afternoon. That's really, really fantastic for Nikki and I to have such a large audience. But just to quickly be clear about the things that we'll be covering, and this isn't a training session, it's an awareness session, just sharing information and key messages. But as part of the session, we do have some information about other training that you can access should you be interested or feel the need and relevance. So it's an awareness and information sharing session. There's a bit of okay, that's gone great. I was going to say there's a bit of background noise with lots of people on the call. That's always sometimes a bit of a challenge, but we will be looking at what the local context is for us in suicide prevention that Nikki's already started to set the scene for in terms of our lead in public health and our group and strategy. We'll look at some of the myths around suicide and the importance of language, communication, and how we may be able to initiate conversations with people we are concerned about, information about training, key resources and information, and local and national support and services, so that you've got some of those to hand should you need to access them either yourself or signpost others to those resources and information. So hopefully we'll be covering things that are important and useful, and then at the end of the session there's a chance to kind of indicate the kind of things that you think you might be able to do for after this session in terms of helping us in our mission to raise awareness around suicide and take measures around suicide prevention when the opportunities arise in the course of our work and lives. So that's just the overview of what we're covering. So I will move into that local context. So this information here just reinforces ultimately the devastating impact that suicide has on the loved ones, family and friends, social and workplace networks of those and communities that are affected by a suicide. And there was a new national suicide prevention strategy for England published at the end of last year, and there, you can see there's a link to that. So when you get the slides after the session, you can access the full strategy if you're interested. But what that highlights is that the suicide rate nationally hasn't fallen now for 6 years. And there are over 5,000 deaths by suicide in England each year. We will cover in a minute some of the local data that we know for Devon and our district areas. But what that national strategy reinforces is that suicide prevention is everybody's business. It will take effort and action and collaboration from government, health and care, VCSC, organisations, education, businesses, communities and individuals. So while most of us on the call are probably here in our kind of professional or working lives, whether that's voluntary or paid or both, or we are also individuals, and there will be circumstances, I'm sure, for most of us in our day-to-day lives when we may be in a position to make a difference to someone who is struggling. So it's being really clear that whoever we are, whatever role we have in our work or personal lives, we can take a role in challenging stigma around suicide, increasing conversation and reducing kind of challenges around talking about our mental health and well-being. We all have mental health to maintain and take care of as much as we do physical health. So it's all about building that capacity across communities and organisations and settings to tackle suicide and prevent suicide in ways and means that are relevant to us in our day-to-day roles. So it's just reinforcing that although, as Nikki said, we take the lead for Devon County Council for suicide prevention, we absolutely cannot do this on our own. And so we really look to our colleagues across communities to support us in raising awareness and taking action where possible. Okay, so we've got a couple of slides now about some local data, just so that people are clear about what some of the trends are for us across the Devon County Council footprint area. We've also got a little bit of comparison to our neighbours over in Plymouth and Torbay as well, so we can see where we fit in that bigger picture, as well as against the national figures. These slides have actually come from a colleague of ours who works in our public health intelligence team, and she's put these together, and they come with a little voiceover. So now I'm really hoping that the recordings work and everyone can hear everything when I press play. So bear with me a moment while I just move us on to the next slide, and I will
Natalie, were you supposed to be hearing something?
Yes, you are. Can you not hear that?
I couldn't, no.
I can.
Okay, right.
I can hear it.
You can hear it, so some people can and some people can't.
Okay, so our settings at this end, thanks.
I'm just turning the volume up on my laptop as well, just because it will be basing itself on my volume settings. So some people can hear and some people can't, right? I'm turning the volume up again. So I might be really loud, sorry if I'm coming across as shouting, and I'll try again. If for any reason some people still can't hear, we do have the wording, so I can read it out after each slide. If anyone can't hear, pop it in the chat and I'll read that out quickly.
Before you start, just so that you know, what we tend to do is take 2 years, right? You know, so you'll notice it's 2020 to 2022. That's because 2022 is it's all based on ONS, so it's data that's been through inquest, and that's our last full data set. So each year was sort of a year behind, so we'd have got the 2022 data in around roughly September 23, and what we do is we look at it 2 years, just because it gives us a bigger number to kind of look at and compare with, so just to make it statistically more kind of valid, really. Off you go.
Thanks, Nikki. Right, we'll move on to the next slide and hopefully people will be able to hear, but if anyone can't, pop it in the chat, and at the end of each slide I will do a quick verbal read through of what our colleague Louise has pre-recorded. So for those who can hear, apologies that you might need to listen to the information twice. Right, let's see how this goes. Okay, I've got nobody in the chat saying they can't hear, but also what I can do is make sure that the accompanying, oh, someone can't hear. Okay, so that's saying that in Devon we have a rate of 13.0 per 100,000, a total count of 277 suicide deaths in that 2020 to 22 period. Our rate in Devon is higher than the England rate, as is Torbay's. You can see that at 16.6 per 100,000. However, Plymouth have a similar rate. And I think it's also worth reflecting that the period that we're looking at would have been impacted by the pandemic and would have delayed inquests. So some death registrations would have been delayed. So, and that is still continuing to have an impact actually. And I think that is picked up in one of the coming slides. But that's looking at our overall rates for all people in Devon, Plymouth, Torbay and England. So I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so I think, yeah, some people are having issues based on laptop and PC settings. Sorry about that, but this is our trend rates. And as you can see along the bottom there, as Nikki said, the data is broken down into 3-year periods that allows us to see that aggregated trend over a period of time. And the green line there is Devon and the black dotted line is England. So you can see we have been tracking a little bit higher than the England rate for quite some time, and that our rate is also, it's starting to increase a little against that England rate. Plymouth have seen a decrease, which is brilliant, and Torbay are also starting to see a bit of a decrease, but that has leveled off a little. Okay, next one. So yeah, sorry that some people are hearing the same information interpreted slightly differently twice. Okay, so if anyone that couldn't hear that, these are our rates by persons total, and then split to male-female rates. All three come. Oh, someone's not muted. If they could mute, please, that would be great. Thank you. So all three rates for Devon are higher than the England equivalent, and for Devon, actually, our female rate this time for the previous period was similar to England, but has now increased to be higher. So again, just briefly for those who are not able to hear, this is looking at our rates by district, which shows that West Devon has the highest rate at 15.2, with Teignbridge second highest at 14.7, although Teignbridge is the only one that is significantly statistically higher than England. The others all come out as statistically similar. And just to be, I'll be as clear as I can, the stats aspect is not my strong point, but even though West Devon has a higher rate, there's a wider confidence interval. So those grey bars you can see are kind of the vertical ones along the top of each of the columns. That's your confidence intervals. And so we have a wider confidence interval there because of a smaller number of deaths in West Devon, even though the rate is slightly higher. So that just gives you the picture across our districts. And just to reflect back on the delay in registrations, one of the things that we, and I'm sure most of you will have picked up, that our overall rate is higher than England, and that change in the female rate to be higher, whereas previously it was similar for us in Devon. There are still ongoing delays in inquests as a result of the impact of the pandemic from the start of 2020. I think the average delay for England for an inquest is now around 150 to 160 days, whereas in Devon, I think we are looking at delays of still around 320 days. So we are keeping a close eye on our data and trends to see if the impact of delayed registrations may be impacting on some of our trend data. So, but at the moment, what we're clear on is that for us, our rates are high, and we need to continue to take action and look at how we can address those and try to bring those down. Okay, there's a question there about confidence intervals.
What are confidence intervals? So they are it's when you're looking at statistics, it's so you can see there's those little grey lines on the bar, and you can see, so West Devon, that's the bottom of the bar is the lowest it possibly is, and then the top is the highest. And as you can see, West Devon, it's got a 15.2, but it could be as low as below 10. It could be as high as just below 25. So it's a way of calculating data and statistics, and that's the kind of leeway, if you like, between the two. So usually the wider that confidence interval, the less reliable that number is. So, you know, when you hear things, you know, because obviously, you know, on the radio, they'll say something like, oh, you know, 20% of people eat porridge for breakfast in the morning. And it's just like they're giving you a very brief snapshot. If you were very clever, you'd say, oh, what are the confidence intervals on that statistic? How reliable is it? That's what it's saying. How reliable is that? And because it's got a big wide one, it's not brilliantly reliable. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, I understand now. Brilliant, thank you. Yes, the explaining statistics is sometimes a little much.
Yeah.
Okay, so that sets the scene in terms of data, just to reflect at that point that these are some of the headline trends and statistics that we're sharing with you here. And as a public health team, we have more data that sits behind that we look at routinely and we use to inform our work and targeting. And we have a summary of some of this information and other information around suicide in Devon, and we will be publishing that information in the coming months. So there'll be additional information available publicly, and we work to develop our data and intelligence picture to understand some of the more the details behind some of those high level trends. So we're just sharing those key messages with you here, but we have a lot more information available to us that we look at. Equivalence in Somerset and Dorset, off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but we can check that and make sure that goes out after the webinar with the slides and resource pack.
Thank you.
No worries. And actually, all of the information on rates by local authority is available publicly nationally. So we can share where you can find that information for all of England and every local authority as well, if that would be helpful.
So I was just doing that because it's on. So I was just briefing. It's on Fingertips. It's something called Fingertips.
That's our public health national database. But yes, if Claire, I could ask you to make a note to remind me, because as we go through, I will lose track of the things that I've said I will do.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Thank you, Claire. And so, as Nikki said at the beginning, we, as public health, we lead suicide prevention on behalf of Devon County Council. We bring together our suicide prevention implementation group, which is a really broad membership partnership. We have all sorts of different organisations and settings who support us through that work. We oversee our suicide prevention strategy and action plan, and we align that plan with the national strategy priorities, but we also take a really good look at what we know about our local population and needs in Devon, so that we are taking direction from the national strategy, but not then taking only that focus, and we are able to respond to and address the needs that we are seeing in our local populations and localities. And so we look at that information, and as well as individuals and services and settings within that partnership taking and leading on particular actions in relation to our priorities and action plan, we also have a role in influence and making sure that we are keeping the messaging around suicide prevention and the work that's going on shared. So this being a prime example of how we try and do that. So we also look to our colleagues on that partnership to share the messaging and information out with others that they're working with who may not be so closely linked to our suicide prevention work. And then we have regular meetings with that group. So yes, I can see Bristol's popped in. We'll do the Southwest. I'm getting distracted. So we use that information, we take decisions locally about how we prioritise, and then we use our regular meetings to review how we're getting on, look at good practice both locally and from the region and nationally. And that's also our forum to be able to respond to any new information on themes or trends that are arising locally that maybe were not known or also present when we were setting the strategy at the outset. So there's always room for us to consider and respond to any new issues that might come up for us. And so this here is a very busy slide, but it sets out the key priority areas for us that are based on those from the national strategy, as well as priority groups that we will be targeting and population risk factors. So just to be clear, population risk factors are things in kind of wider society that may have an impact on people's health and well-being, and these are things that are known to be particularly important when considering suicide prevention and factors that may contribute to the circumstances that people are in that may lead them to distress attempts and or taking their life. Now, our strategy, Nikki is taking to our Health and Wellbeing Board next Thursday. So at the moment, these are still technically draft, but the majority are also in the national strategy. So it's unlikely these will change significantly, but once our Health and Wellbeing Board have signed that off, we will be able to publish our strategy and action plan as it stands. The action plan will always remain live and be updated according to progress. Something else just to make people clear about is our real-time surveillance system. This is something that actually covers Devon, Plymouth and Torbay. It's a system where data is shared by the police around their sudden deaths where there's basically not murder. The police terminology is sudden self-inflicted deaths, which is police terminology. It's not how we would describe that generally, but so it's where it may be a sudden unexpected death.
Sorry, apologies. I was just saying that as we were saying before, the data that we've just showed you has been through, that is ONS data. So there's been an inquest and there's been a verdict of suicide. The real-time surveillance data is that we have more timely, so actually weekly, from the police, and it's suspected suicide. So there's been no coronial decision about it, but it just gives us an indication much earlier on as to how many deaths are occurring in the area, and so that if we need to respond to something quite quickly, we can, because obviously if we're waiting for the coroner, we could be waiting 18 months, by which time any kind of learning or anything, you know, that we might be able to follow up is fairly cold. So that's why we started using the real-time surveillance. Back over to Natalie, sorry.
That's all right, thanks, Nikki. And so as Nikki said, that gives us much more timely information. To be really clear, the primary aim of our real-time surveillance system is so that we are in a position as a system to really quickly refer people and or signpost people to our suicide bereavement support service in Devon. We talk a bit about that later in the services and signposting section, but because what is well evidenced is that if you are bereaved by suicide, your own risk of suicide increases. So the primary, and as Nikki has just said, waiting for a coroner to reach a conclusion could delay access to bereavement support when it's most needed. And we have a bereavement support service, which we'll talk through. So the police can either refer people if they're happy to be referred, but they also carry information about our bereavement support service to hand over to bereaved next of kin and loved ones fairly quickly, and they can then contact the service directly themselves. And so we use that data, and again, it hasn't gone through the coronial process, so it's indicative. It's not it's not data that we share publicly because it hasn't gone through that process yet, but it does give us that early indication around places, public places where we may need to take some targeted action if there are any novel and unusual methods, possible clusters, which in a later section when we're talking about language, we talk a bit more about what clusters are, but that is where we may see more deaths than we would expect to see in a particular location or around a particular period of time or within a particular kind of population group. And we always take a focus on under 25 and particularly under 18 deaths. And we have a group of key services that meet every month to look at the deaths from the previous month, and that enables us to have a really good multi-agency communication and response. And we don't always wait for that meeting. There are some cases where a response may be stood up in it almost immediately, particularly for under 18 deaths. And like I said, this system we have across Devon, Plymouth and Torbay. So that helps us again with some of our more immediate prevention and targeted work we can do, as well as looking at our long-term data. And then finally, we do work really closely with colleagues in public health teams in Plymouth and Torbay. We have some shared projects with them around community training. Again, we've got information on that for you later, and some other projects that we work on collectively to make sure we're making the most of resources, because lots of boundary crossovers, as I'm sure you're all aware. We work really closely with Devon Partnership Trust around the work that they do addressing suicide in their patients and clients of services, but also we work together on prevention and awareness raising. We have an oversight group we have to report to across One Devon. It is in the One Devon Joint Forward Plan, if people are familiar with that, that we have an overall objective to reduce our suicide rate in the next, well, it's 4 years now, to be in line with or below the England rate. And we link through regional and local networks to share good practice and challenges, because yeah, as we said at the beginning, it's everyone's business and collaboration is really important. So that's our local context. I'll hand over to Nikki.
Unmute. I thought it was really interesting. I thought when we were doing this, I had a quick look around the history around suicide, and even though it actually became a crime in common law in the mid 13th century, but obviously had been condemned as a moral sin much earlier than that. What I found interesting was not only, I think I knew that if you died by suicide, you weren't allowed to have a Christian burial or be buried in consecrated ground. There was some pretty horrendous stuff actually about being buried sort of like, you know, way out of town with a stake to hold you down. But also any family that the person had would have been stripped of their belongings. So I think it's I just think it's quite interesting when we sort of like think about the stigma around suicide, and some of the myths that still perpetuate around suicide kind of stem from that long on, even though suicide actually hasn't been a crime since 1961. And apparently your possessions could be forfeited right up until 1822. So I think, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, how things that happen in the past still have that kind of echo into the future. But like, as you know, this was just me really leading into the pathway. So there's really lots of myths around suicide, and they can, you know, have a negative impact in the way that we kind of recognize suicide, how we respond to people who may be feeling suicidal. So I think we just wanted to quickly go through some of those. So you know, one of the so you know, these are the things that, so maybe just a little bit of, I mean, I think because there's so many of us on the call, it's a bit hard to do a kind of call and response, but maybe just a time to sort of think about these yourself. So here's some of the sort of like statements, and just decide, you know, in your own head, just think about this. Is this true, or is this just a fiction? So a suicidal person won't ask for help. And if someone is to pretend, so I've heard this before, oh no, people who are really suicidal don't ask for help. You know, if they're determined to take their own life, there's nothing we can do. People who talk about suicide don't do it. People who make repetitive remarks about feeling suicidal just aren't genuine. Sometimes, you know, even I'm jumping down, sometimes it can be seen as it's attention-seeking behavior. If I ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal, it might put the idea in their head. So that's another kind of thing, that it's a selfish act. So suicide, it's really selfish act. It's the easy way out. They took the easy way out. And the other one, you have to be mentally ill to think about suicide. So let's just have a think about those statements and think, you know, that it's not a quiz or a test, but just think about yourself whether those, because we've all possibly all heard these statements about suicide, and just think, you know, are these true or false? So let's have a look. So, myth: a suicidal person won't ask for help, and someone is determined to end their life. There is nothing we can do about it. So obviously Natty and I would not be sat here if if we believed that if someone feels that if someone's determined to end their life, there's nothing we can do. We believe there's lots we can do. And obviously, not everyone who thinks about suicide will tell anyone. And I think hopefully my preamble into sort of the history and some of the stigma around it and some of the shame still associated with suicide is probably the things that stop people from expressing the feeling that they're suicidal. There's a certain amount of shame potentially that comes with even that feeling. And here it says there may be some warning signs. However, it's always easy. It's easy to sort of like ignore those or just not notice them. So people who talk about suicide that don't do it, people who make repetitive remarks about feeling suicidal not genuine. Yes, of course, it's a myth. The fact that someone tells you does not mean they're at less risk of taking their own life. And actually, it's really important then is how we respond to that statement. If someone says they're feeling suicidal, how we respond to that's really, really important. Asking about suicide might give someone the idea. This is a very common idea. There was a long time. If we ask someone if they're feeling suicidal, it might put the idea in their head. There's absolutely no evidence that is the case, that asking direct questions about suicide does that. In fact, it's more likely to give permission to somebody to sort of say, yes, they are. And gosh, release the burden of that. And also, it doesn't put the idea into people's head. People are either feeling suicidal, they don't suddenly go, oh yeah, that's a thought. Yeah, it just doesn't work like that. And so that's why we, a lot of our training and a lot of our advice and what we're talking today is about, it is okay to ask the question if somebody's feeling suicidal. It's really okay to ask that question. Like I say, it's just what we do with that question, how we respond to it. That is the key part. It's a selfish act and an easy way out. I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a moment, but there is this sense sometimes that people might genuinely feel that the world and people around them would be better off without them. So it's this, it's like this burden, feeling of being a burden to other people around. So it's not a selfish act, and it's certainly not an easy way out. I should imagine, it's a really difficult thing to do. It's attention seeking. They might be trying to draw attention to the fact that they're in crisis and that they need help. And it's always important to take it seriously and by reaching out and asking people. So just because somebody said, and sadly, when I have looked at audits, there have been a number of people who've said, I am going to kill myself if I don't get any help. And that's exactly what they've done. So yeah, it does, just because they're saying it doesn't mean to say that it's attention seeking at all. It's a real cry for help, I think. And finally, yeah, so I think suicide is always, there's that really strong, it's really interesting. I was researching for this, I was looking at something yesterday and about the link between depression and suicide, and apparently only 4% of people who've been treated for depression end their lives in suicide. So although depression obviously is a motivating factor, it's not necessarily as big a one as we think it is. And I think it's very easy to think that suicide is it's a sign of mental distress, but I think mental distress, without opening a whole can of worms, I don't think mental distress is the same as being mentally ill. And although of course people who are mentally ill do end their lives by suicide, I think only 65% of people that end their lives by suicide aren't known to mental health services at all. So they've never had any contact with mental health services. So signs that someone may not be okay. This is very difficult, and I think it's very difficult to say these are the signs you need to look for, because obviously everyone's different. Everyone deals with their emotions differently, and when you talk, sometimes people talk about when people have ended their lives by suicide, well, they seem fine. In fact, they seem really happy that day, or you know, so it's so we could sort of like talking very generally about some of the things that might you might be able to sort of like look at. So it might be useful to maybe, rather than looking for the signs, you know, like in people's behavior, although obviously if someone's behavior has changed, that might be an indication. I've just used the classic example of maybe someone who's been quite upset and miserable for you know, for a while, and then all of a sudden they're happy, and that might be, you know, because they've made a plan and made a decision they're going to end their own life, and somehow that's kind of, it's given them a way out, so they're, you know, so they're you know, their mood is alleviated slightly. But I think it's also it's more important as well to maybe understand some of the circumstances, or what we would call risk factors, that might you know, might make it hard for somebody to cope, or might make somebody consider suicide. And this is for those more academically minded about you, this is a model of suicide behaviour. So it's a guy called Rory O'Connor, who's a psychologist and who's done a lot of research into why people end their lives by suicide. And he's kind of broken it down into 3 stages. And, you know, he's talking about the sort of like stage 1 being this pre-motivational period. So some of the, you know, the background, the events and the triggers. So diathesis is just another word for vulnerability. So it's that, you know, so the person has certain vulnerabilities, and they might stem into things like previous, you know, childhood trauma or other ACEs. It might be about that they're, you know, in poor housing, they're vulnerable to being homeless, something like that. So ditto the environment. So, you know, it's plus where their environment, you know, the situation they're in, plus life events. And we know that key life events can be triggers to suicide. So breakdown in relationships, financial problems, so maybe loss of job. We know that poor physical health is another one. So, you know, all those things could sort of like be in the background, you know, that cause that sort of more likelihood of starting to feel suicidal. Now, the motivational phase looks very complicated, but I think what Rory's trying to say here, and it's quite interesting, he's sort of saying that, you know, the kind of suicidal feeling. So when people start to have suicidal thoughts, and I think he stresses there's a really big, it's quite common to have suicidal thoughts. You know, a lot of people have suicidal thoughts, and I think that's really important to highlight, because, you know, sometimes people think, I'm having a suicidal thought, oh my goodness, you know, it's not uncommon to have those thoughts. And, you know, as we always say, we're kind of living and breathing suicide for most of our working lives, so it'd be really quite you know, it wouldn't be anything out of the usual for, say, Natalie and I to have, you know, those kind of thoughts either, because we're in the thick of it. But so, but there's a really big step between having those thoughts and acting upon them. That's a massive leap. So, you know, I think that's something really sort of like important to bear in mind, and to bear in mind maybe if you're working with people who say they're feeling suicidal, the step between that and actually acting upon it is massive. And Rory talks about that motivational phase, or that ideation, you know, when you're starting to feel suicidal, is usually stemming from some kind of defeat or humiliation. So if you think back to what I just said about relationship breakdown, loss of job, loss of status, you know, something like a significant life event, plus possibly background ability, you know, patterns of behavior about dealing with stress and stuff. And then this entrapment. So the entrapment is being stuck in a situation where you feel that you can't get out of. So quite often we say, well, Bethan, I would really look after yourself, and, you know, there is support you can have, and we will get back to that. You know, if you stay on the call, we know there's support you can go into. But that entrapment is being in a situation where they feel there's no escape. So then we all often say, quite often, people who end their lives by suicide don't want to die. They just can't see how they can continue to live with the way that things are. And that's I think that's really, really key. And also, like we said, that Rory's got some lovely words like thwarted belongingness, so that's sort of like slight social isolation. So when people start to feel isolated from other people, but then also might feel that they're being a burden on people that are around them, so loved ones and family. So that kind of feeling of the world would be better off without me. No one would miss me if no one would probably even notice if I or really miss me. So really being able to work yourself up into that stage. What then pushes in this model people into actual suicidal behavior? I think he says it relies on lots of things, like, for example, whether you've had a kind of sorry, I've lost access to the means is always a really big one. So how able you are to access a means of suicide. Planning, so actually starting to plan. So in the old days when people used to try and risk assess whether someone was actually suicidal, quite often that would be one of the questions: have you got a plan? Exposure to suicidal behaviour. So what we do know is people who've had known somebody, or had a family member who died by suicide, have a higher risk of ending their own lives by suicide, which is, as Natalie said earlier on, which is why with our real-time surveillance, one of our really key objectives is to ensure that everybody has access, or is able to link into our bereavement charity. And thank you, Natalie. And we've just put the number up now, given the conversation in the chat, because absolutely anybody, you don't have to have been a family member, or absolutely anybody who's affected by a death can access support from Pete's Dragons. So we would encourage people to do so. So impulsivity. So is it somebody who's got, has an impulsive personality? Because again, there's a link between that impulsivity and somebody maybe going on to end suicide. And then there's something he says about having a higher tolerance to pain, a fearlessness about dying. So not, and I sometimes think about my, I used to work in homelessness, and some of that, working around some groups that have that real ambivalence to, I don't really care if I live or die. That's going to up your risk. Not having any fear of dying, being able to imagine yourself by death, and also, of course, any past behavior. So previous behaviors around self-harm and suicide attempts are all going to increase your likelihood to end your life by suicide. Thank you, Natalie. Hopefully, we've said language really matters. So, I've just mentioned, where I think some of the stigma comes from with suicide, and the fact that it used to be a criminal offence. So we know that people who've got lived experience, either attempted suicide themselves or have been bereaved by suicide, really don't like the term committed suicide. And I know every time I hear it, it makes me wince. I've had to go on. I'm terrible on Facebook, I'm there, so please don't use that term. Whenever there's a discussion, and it, so we have to, so language is really important, but please don't let that inhibit you to not ask the question and start talking to somebody. Next slide, please. So this is something that was devised by colleagues at Dorset at the Bournemouth University, about the importance of language and terminology. So I won't go through the whole list, but it's just the things where we try and use less kind of more inclusive language around suicide. That's sort of less stigmatizing. Oh, have we done this one before? So just in some other, so multiple suicides. This is where one or more suicide occurs in close time frame and proximity. It doesn't always amount to a cluster. A suicide cluster, if you hear anyone talking about suicide clusters, it's a very specific kind of phenomena where you have two or more deaths, like we said, within a time frame or within a specific place, or sometimes we might look by specific method where we think they might be linked in some way, because what we then want to do is prevent what we call contagion. So I suppose the most famous example of this, if people are old enough, because it's years ago now, was in Bridgend in Wales, when there was a series of suicides among young people, and this is, gosh, nearly 30 years ago. So that's, you want to kind of make sure that you're trying to prevent further suicides. And so say if it's within a friendship group or within a a peer group, because I would, sticking my neck out, say it is more common around younger people, where or suicide pacts, all those kind of things. So that's the reason why we specifically look at clusters. And then obviously, because of our real-time surveillance, and we've mentioned, we talk about suspected suicide. So that is a death that has not been to inquest and it's not been confirmed by the coroner, because it's not for me or anyone else to decide if a death is a suicide or not. That is the job of the coroner, and lo behold me to think that I can make that decision above him. So or her. So yeah, so we talk about suspected suicides a lot. So yes, I think we've covered this really. So that the stigma, I think all that history, like I said, someone who's having suicidal thoughts might be ashamed of those thoughts, so reluctant to ask help. They might be worried about alarming other people or not being understood. It can also, the stigma, like we said, it can also inhibit people who want to help because they're scared of doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing. But I think what we find the evidence is that if someone's feeling suicidal, and actually asking them can just, like I say, really kind of be a relief that they're able to talk about it. And it can be the first step in them helping to find support and talking down, and it can help break down those barriers as well.
Thanks, Nikki. So yeah, I can see some of the comments in the chat there. Yeah, and I think also just to reinforce the conversation around cluster, there is really clear guidance from what used to be called Public Health England, but is now part of, it's the Office for Health Inequalities and Disparities. So there is really clear guidance for local areas to use in considering whether there may or may not be a cluster, and we have really clear processes to follow in terms of looking at that and then taking action in appropriate response to those situations. And that's where our real-time surveillance data, it comes into its own really, because it does allow that really quick identification of concerns and being able to connect with people to look at the circumstances and does something constitute a cluster, or are they unlinked, but we still may need to do some targeted work in particular areas or with particular groups. And so moving on from that kind of understanding language and terminology is thinking about what can we do if we're worried about someone, and that may be someone that we're quite close to, or that we work with, or that we spend time with socially, or just someone that we see out and about. And again, just to reinforce, although we have talked about the importance of language and terminology, and Nikki's already said this, but just to really reinforce it, is not to let worry about saying the wrong thing get in the way of asking and offering that opportunity for somebody to talk. It's always okay to say, I'm worried, I'm here, if you want to talk, I can listen. I may not always have the right answer or know what to say, but I'm here and I can listen. And yeah, allowing someone that space and letting them know that you're there. is the most important thing. We can, and yeah, we're not perfect. Showing concern and giving someone that time and space is so important. And so it's asking questions. We've got, yes, training that we'll come on to, but these are just some basic messaging. And like I say, this is an awareness session. We can't go into every scenario or lots of detail, but it's just some of this is really basic, good communication skills that I'm sure lots of people on the call already know and have and use on a daily basis. It's the basic stuff like good eye contact and paying attention and not being distracted and looking at your phone while someone's trying to talk to you, and using open questions. For anyone who isn't clear, an open question is something that doesn't just require a yes or no answer. And I think acknowledging if if it is someone you think you know quite well, that you've noticed that they maybe don't see themselves, or they've been a bit quieter, or just something seems to have shifted. I think even just that acknowledgement that you've noticed can be really powerful for somebody, that someone else has recognised that they may be having a hard time. And sometimes you might need to ask more than once. But if someone is not willing to talk at that point, then saying, okay, but I am around if you want to. It's letting people know that opportunity is there if at that point in time they don't feel able to have that conversation. And as we've said already, not being, it can be difficult, especially if it's not a conversation you're used to having. It takes a bit of confidence and bravery sometimes to ask the question, are you thinking about suicide? But just really understanding that that's not going to put an idea in somebody's head. And it may actually be the thing that allows somebody to be honest about how they're feeling, and recognizing, excuse me, that we don't have to have the answers. Our role might just be to listen and help that person identify what other support they might need. It's not thinking that if you start that conversation with somebody, you have to then come up with all the solutions to their problems and be there to fix things. It's listening. And understanding what might help for that person, and if they need a bit of extra support to access some of that kind of help and services, knowing where you can signpost people to is just as important as having the conversation. So yeah, it's not putting anyone in a position where you feel like, I'm not an expert, I can't have that conversation, so I'm just not going to ask the question. It's, yeah, you don't have to be an expert to support someone who's having a hard time. And what's really important is that trying it, and we can all do it at times, is we can all kind of have our internal kind of thoughts and judgments about different situations and scenarios, but it's paying attention to what that person's saying, not that there are, again, it's phrases, it's like you're not thinking of doing something silly or making kind of value judgments, or well, there are people that have it much worse off than you. It's that kind of just sitting and going with where that person is, and the things that they're saying are difficult at that point in time. I think it's absolutely reasonable saying there are services that can help and I can give you information if you want it, but it's that when this happened to me, I had to, I did this and this helped me. If people are asking for that kind of information, great, but generally it's just letting them talk rather than leaping in with kind of suggestions or advice. And again, it's just accepting that in that moment, that person, what they're feeling is what they're feeling and the thoughts that they're having. But that intensity of those feelings can change, and as Nikki was talking about before, there may be things going on in people's lives that are increasing their stress and leading them to think about suicide, but it's that, and some suicides are impulsive, they do happen with seemingly without any or people thinking that there was something that might have been going on for that person. So if someone is expressing distress, it's recognizing that those feelings may not always last, and perhaps also thinking about if they've had hard times before, what's helped before, and what's been useful for them in getting to a day or a time when they feel a bit more positive and less of those feelings are present for them. And then it is about, you're not the expert, you're not there to give the answers, so it's making sure that they know and are able to get help from services that are there to support them. One of the in the resource pack that we get to in a little while, we have an updated version of a resource that we've had for quite some time in Devon called It's Okay to Talk About Suicide, and that's got some of this information in it and pointers about having conversations. And we've also got links in the resource pack to some really great resources from the Samaritans, which is about that opening a conversation and things to be thinking about if you are having a conversation with somebody. So it's definitely worth taking a bit of time to look at those. But as we said, there's no formula. There's no, if you ask this and say this is what's going to work. It's just having a good conversation, listening, paying attention, being kind. Basically, kindness and compassion goes a long way when we're talking to people who might be struggling. But recognizing that it can be a real challenge. It can be fearful if you think someone's struggling to think, oh, can I ask that question? It can be scary and hard to do that, and to think, oh, I'm just not going to because I'm not sure I can do this, and that's okay. But what we also have are some really good, at the moment, they're funded to be free to attend, some really great training offers. So if you want to develop your existing practice and skills, your opportunity to understand a bit more about some of the things we've been talking about today, a key aim for us is normalising conversations about mental health and wellbeing. So when people are struggling, it doesn't feel like such a big leap to ask a question, because we're talking more day to day about how we're getting on, things that might be tough, but also when things are going well. It's not just about having the conversations when things are tough. And so there are three training offers that we currently fund. The Connect 5 offer there, we fund through our public health money in Devon, and the Community Suicide Awareness and Emotional Resilience is money that we share with Plymouth and Torbay. In the information you'll get afterwards will be links to how you can get more information and sign up to these training courses. They can all be delivered online, and I think now they can all be done in person as well, if needed. And I know that there was a question in the chat from somebody further up about safety planning, and the Community Suicide Awareness and Emotional Resilience course is very much focused around that. It's not about trying to assess risk or gauge risk. As Nikki said before, that's not the kind of most helpful approach. It's recognised that that's not the most helpful approach.
Yeah, and the other thing about the community suicide awareness as well is that it sits really well with the clinical training that DPT provide, and we've just done some training for GPs, so it's all around the same thing, around safety planning. And I think, you know, with that ambition to create a common language across the system around suicide and suicide prevention, so it's really our plug to say, you know, if you're interested at all, it's fully funded. I think it's fairly flexible. Like I say, you can join online. It's 3.5 hours. So we're really urging everybody, if you know, it's very entry level. If you've done suicide awareness before, it just might be a refresh. If you've done nothing before, it's a really good entry level. So yeah, we're just recommending.
Thanks, Nikki. And yes, thanks, Becca. Devon Partnership Trust is the mental health provider. That's okay. And also just to reflect that both, in fact, all three courses are very much underpinned by compassion and taking compassionate approaches to others. And not just to others, but to ourselves. And so as we said at the beginning, and as has been reflected through some of the conversation in the chat, that we also have to be really good about taking care of ourselves and getting the support that we need. So there is a focus through all of those offers about recognising our own well-being and not just focusing on the things we can do to support others, and particularly the emotional resilience one that is very much focused on taking care of ourselves and developing our own kind of sort of self-care plans and recognising how we build our mental health and well-being for ourselves, so that if we do experience any difficult or challenging periods, we have some, you know, the cup's not always half full before we experience that. So they are really good. They're evidence-based offers, and yeah, they're free to attend at the moment. So, and just to reflect that, although we do try and target some of that training because it comes with funding, that these are the kind of workforces and audiences that we are trying to target. But ultimately, anyone with an interest and who feels that training would be of benefit is able to book that on. There's no turning people away, basically. If you want to access the training, it's there. But in line with our suicide prevention strategy, those priority groups and risk factors that we had on that slide at the beginning, in terms of things like financial well-being, domestic abuse, contact with the criminal justice system, younger and middle-aged men, anyone working or encountering individuals that sit within those risk groups and factors, we would be particularly keen to engage. But like we say, anyone who is interested. And as we talked about with our real-time surveillance data, where we're looking at suspected suicides, if we see through that data that there may be particular localities or geographic areas where we have some concerns, or we're seeing changes in deaths, then we can also look to try and target the training offers to organisations and settings in those areas too. So yes, we promote it broadly and widely, but it's also one of our tools in response to situations that that we need to put extra measures in around. And then bearing in mind that training is, being released for training and having the capacity to do that can always be a challenge. If people aren't familiar, Zero Suicide Alliance have some really great, really accessible online e-learning, and they have different modules for some different work. So there's one around veterans, there's one for taxi drivers, and there are some general ones and some other more specific ones. So if you aren't already familiar with those, I would absolutely recommend having a look at those too. Samaritans have courses too. Some of those may be fee paying, but they can also do some work with specific organisations. Papyrus, if people aren't familiar, is a suicide prevention organisation that work particularly around children and young people, and actually they go up to the age of 35 in terms of their remit and their focus, but they also have some training available. And Pete's Dragons, who we've mentioned as our suicide bereavement service, and we've talked a little bit about what they offer and we'll cover a bit more in a moment, but they support us with the coordination and administration of our training offers. So they do all that booking for us, but they also have some of their own training offers that they deliver. And again, some of those are fee paying. But all the information is on their website on the range of courses that they offer themselves as an organisation. So there's a real opportunity to think about what you as an individual or what your service or organisation or community might need in terms of the intensity or the degree of training you need. For some, it might just be some awareness. For others, it might be something like applied suicide intervention, which is a more intensive one where people are regularly supporting people in significant distress and expressing suicidal ideation and intent. So there's a range there that people can access. And like I say, the links to our offers will be in the information you get with the slides in the resource pack. And so in terms of resources, we've mentioned the OK to Talk About Suicide leaflet. That's available online. The content is available online. I think Nikki's just going to wave it in front of the camera so you can see. We also have hard copies, Z card leaflets. So they are easy to pop in a wallet, a pocket or a bag. And the information where you access the resource online also gives you the email address if you want to get hold of some hard copies. We can send those out to people. Help is at Hand is a really, really good resource to be aware of. It's developed nationally and we do use it routinely locally. It's lots of information about the practical aspects of having to respond to a sudden unexpected death like a suspected suicide, as well as that emotional support. And First Hand is a similar resource, but it's very much aimed at people who may be affected by the suicide of someone they didn't know. So witnesses or bystanders, for example, first responders, and recognising that even if you didn't know that person very well or even at all, if you have been exposed in some way to that death, either as a witness or they are someone that maybe you work with but you didn't know them that well, it's recognizing that we can all be affected, and it doesn't have to come down to whether or not you're a member of their family or a close friend to feel justified in being affected. So it's recognizing that there are resources and support out there, regardless of how you might have been affected by a suspected or suicide. And then I put this information in the chat earlier. These are just some of the, and there's more information. I know Becca and colleagues quite a few years ago, I think, had put together a suicide prevention resource pack that was shared with colleagues after a session like this from a few years ago, and we've looked at that and updated that, so you will get that, and there is a lot more information in there. We're just highlighting a couple of things with you online now. So Samaritans, Papyrus and Shout are all national organisations, all 24/7 and all free to access. First Response is the urgent kind of access for mental health support for Devon residents who are 18 and over, and Child Family Health Devon provide the equivalent for under 18s. So it's just knowing where those local services are, but also where those national ones are. And again, it's just if you're worried about someone and you've got that information and you're familiar with it, then it's a lot easier to share that with somebody and support them to access support, as well as thinking about it for ourselves, because it's recognizing we can all struggle from time to time, and knowing who's there to talk to if you need it is so important. So like I say, those are just some key ones, but there's more information on others in the resource pack. So Pete's Dragons, Nikki's already covered, but we're incredibly lucky to have our Pete's Dragons colleagues in Devon. They are amazing. They provide that suicide bereavement service across Devon, Plymouth and Torbay, and they are actually also commissioned to provide that service in, is it North Somerset?
Yeah,
I think it's North Somerset. And as Nikki said, that is for anyone impacted by suicide. They support children and adults, and they will also offer support regardless of when the death happened. So it's not just there's no time frame in terms of it has to have happened within the last 6 months or year. You can access their support at any time. And so, as we've said, as part of our real-time surveillance system, our police colleagues will actively refer and signpost people to Pete's Dragons for support, and that offer will be reinforced if people aren't wanting to take it up at the outset. As it says there, they don't hold waiting lists. It's an incredible service, and they're very responsive. So yeah, just have a look at their website if you're not familiar with who they are and what they offer. But that it's really important to know that resource is there, and that it isn't limited to immediate family or friends or by any kind of time period. This is just a little bit to let you know about who we are and what we do. So we have some information on the Devon County Council website. We're in the process of working on and developing and building this information. So it's pretty basic at the moment, but it is a priority for us to build and develop that in relation to our strategy and action plan and the work that we're doing. But on there at the moment, you can access that online version of the OK to Talk leaflet and the information on how you can get hard copies. There's our last year's strategy is on there at the moment, because until we get sign off from Health and Wellbeing Board, hopefully next week, and our new one won't be there, but it will be as soon as we've had it signed off. There's the link there to our training information, and also to local services signposting and support, and that web presence will develop over the coming months and year for us in response to the work we do, and making sure that we are giving as much information as we can to help local organisations and communities raise awareness of suicide and take action for themselves. There's also information on there about our strategic implementation group. So if you wanted to know a bit more about that, or discuss if that's something that you might want to get involved in, then please contact Nikki and I. We're always happy to have a conversation about bringing other people on board to help us with that work. The resource pack, I just want to also caveat it by saying that it's not exhaustive. There may be things that some of you are familiar with that we haven't got in there, because one of the things that we've been learning through some of our work over the last couple of years is how much goes on out in communities that we weren't cited on. So if in response to getting that you think, oh, there's this organisation here and they're not listed, please do let us know, because it's always good for us to keep up to date. And there's 2 of us, and Devon County Council's a wide geographical area, so we're always happy to hear if there are things that you think we may not be aware of that it would be useful for us to be. And then the intention is that the information we've collated in that resource pack will then be held on those web pages, so that there will always be a central up-to-date place to go, rather than having to constantly update individual versions and people not always having the most current information about services and contact information. As an example, I sent an email out it was about 4 weeks ago with some information, and my colleague from one of the services that I listed emailed me to say that their phone number had changed the day before. So it's always that battle about keeping the information up to date, but that's why we want to develop those web pages, so people have a central place to go and get that information, and that we link that to some of the other places people use routinely too. So we would link that through. I know there's already information on the Community Safety Partnership website, but we would be working really closely with Becca and Claire to make sure that any information is the same and linked effectively. So we have allowed a little bit of time for questions. I know we've tried to answer some as they have come through in the chat. I can see hands up. My screen's really tiny. Is that Yona?
Yona.
Hello, that's right. Thank you. Yeah.
What's your question? I'm not sure if you've accidentally hit mute, Yona, but I can't hear you. I'm not sure what's happened. If you can't, if it's easier, pop it in the chat and we can try and respond, Yona, but I can't hear you at the moment. I'm not sure what's happened there. Okay. Yona, if you can put it in the chat, we'll respond. Are there any questions while we're trying to work out what's happening for Yona? Hi, Yona, great, you're in the chat. That's brilliant. Pop it in the chat. Are Are there any other questions from the chat that we've missed so far? That's okay, Jonna, just type your question and we can respond.
I think we answered quite a lot of them, hopefully.
If anyone has put a question in the chat and they don't think we've answered it, please feel free to flag that with us or pop your hand up. No, okay. Any other questions from the floor?
Oh, Nova.
Nova.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Cool, brilliant. There's a lady that I'm working with at the moment who has made an attempt on herself but was pulled out of the way. And I've been having daily welfare checks with her and she's definitely improving, which is great. She has a history of eating disorder, and I obviously can't go into amount of detail, but one of the things, the only kind of protective factor that seems to be for her is her children. My question, I suppose, is that access to her children may be being denied, and that's part of what she's going through. And seeing as it's the only preventative measure that I can kind of hold on to at the moment in terms of positivity, I've got a question around how do I continue to support her when the likelihood is that her children will be removed. And one of the ways that she puts it is that she doesn't like to do anything that's normal, including eating, washing herself, etc., because that is normal, doesn't deserve it. And that's acting as if life is normal and life carries on, so on and so forth. And that's not what's happening for her. Her life isn't carrying on, and it is not. So I know that's a really intense question to ask, but I was just wondering if anybody, or if there's any resources that you can push me towards. I allow her lots of time to talk and that sort of stuff, but there's only so much. You can't kind of think, oh yeah, well, it'll get better. Do you know what I mean? It's not that sort of situation. Any advice?
Oh gosh, that's and I just say I hope that you're getting support with that, Nova, because that's quite a lot to carry. And I think there is something, sadly within our roles. I mean, I don't really, it's 4:45. It's probably not the time to get involved in the debate about, in an ideal world, we'd think that, you'd be able to flag that up and she'd get some sort of support from mental health services. But I know that's not always going to happen.
No, she's refusing to access any mental help. It's part of this kind of self-punishment thing. So.
And I suppose it's a point at which, within your job role and within your specification, you're probably doing everything that you can. And I think sometimes that, it's a really difficult one, because we try to sort, of course we're trying to support people who are feeling suicidal. We're trying to prevent that suicide, but but at the end of the day, there is only so much we can do. And I suppose it's really trying to accept that, isn't it? That you're doing everything that you can, you're doing your best, and to, but that's the extent, that you can help. And I suppose I would say it's just carry on with being, because you don't know, having that one person in her life who's not being judgmental and critical and is listening, might just be another protective factor that's keeping her going.
We're very lucky in the sense of the whole team and a further team is around her, so she does have that. So,
and I'm just like, I just hope that you get really good support yourself, because that is exactly the sort of thing where you're carrying a really really heavy thing there, and bless you. And I just, you know, like, just look after yourself. That would be my main advice. Look after yourself. Yeah.
And I've just dropped into the chat a link to some of the Samaritans resources around if you're worried about or supporting someone else, because that's the other thing to recognise, is that the Samaritans can also be there to support people who are worried about or supporting others. So have a look and see if there's anything in there. Jonna, I can see your question was about hospital discharge after an attempt, and what kind of support there is. And I think some of that will be about, there are mental health liaison teams in A&E and hospitals. How it's a difficult one to, again, it comes down to the availability and accessibility of services, and how quickly people might be referred or accepting of support as well. Nikki, I don't know if there's, in terms of discharge from hospital, and it's a tricky thing for us in terms of, we don't get data or information about attempts. So there's some generic data about admissions for specific things, but we don't get individual data. So
I think, again, the questions is, you know, it's the same as we were saying to Nova. I think in an ideal world, you'd like to think that if somebody had been admitted to hospital for an attempt, there would be some kind of wraparound support for them on discharge. And you know, it's a shame, you know, I do think maybe when we do this again, we should get George, our colleague from...
Can I just interject? I'm from Devon Partnership Trust. So I work for this, I manage the social work team. I mean, it's difficult to answer the question without knowing the full context. So I guess it would depend on whether somebody was admitted under the Mental Health Act, or whether they had a suicide attempt and then went into hospital to sort of try to save them. And often people, well, they're not often actually, they're not always open to mental health services. But if there was an attempt on somebody's life, I would imagine generally you'll get the psych liaison team involved if they were admitted to the general ward, and they might do a mental health status examination and determine whether that person needs to be assessed by the AMP service or by the mental health, you know, under the Mental Health Act. And sometimes they can be detained, sometimes not. Often they will ask, they will refer them on, or give some advice around signpost and information. That's what they would normally do. And the other part is, I just wonder whether, so sometimes social care is factored in. So depending on if a person is receiving services or not, if there are potential social care needs there, and there's an appearance of a need, then sometimes somebody could also be referred either to Devon Partnership Trust if they're open to them, or to the Devon County Council social care teams to look at whether they need some support in specific areas. So sometimes that can help. Normally getting into Devon Partnership Trust, it would be via the GP, but if they've been admitted into hospital under a section, then often what happens is they get a referral straight into the community mental health team. But that also depends on the individual as well, and whether they agree to that. So it's difficult to answer the question in totality without knowing the full context.
Well, thank you for stepping in, Maria. That was really helpful. And I've got another question here on the line, and from Helen Rolls, about farming and thinking about stats with farmers taking their own lives. Well, if you think back to my little slide, you know, obviously farmers are a high risk group because they have access to the means. So, and obviously, you know, there's been, especially with a lot of the state of farming, you know, there's been a lot of issues. However, we do link in, actually, one of the groups on our steering group that we've been talking about is the farming community network. So we are linked in with them. They do an awful amount of work around suicide prevention, and I'm sure not just in Devon, but, you know, as part of their role wider. So yes, we do have those links into the farming community, and we do support the work of the farming community network as well. So we've supported them through training, and I'm just going to flash, okay to say, talk about leaflets and everything. So yeah, we're aware of farmers.
I can see there's a hand up just on the screen at the moment. One of the things we would ask people
to say, sorry, I may have missed the slide or the information about that, but thank you very much.
That's okay.
yeah, we haven't specifically talked about farmers on the slides. We have our suicide prevention implementation group, our partnership group that helps us with the our strategy and local action plan, and we have representatives from the farming network in that membership.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
No worries, Helen. So yes, on screen at the moment and also in the chat, just if people have, could help us out with this, we've got a call to action, just the things that you might be able to do following on from the webinar today. It's things like sharing information, booking on training or looking at training. It's all anonymous. It just helps us get that perspective on the kind of things that people think they can do following the webinar today. And then also there's a link in the chat, but you should, if my tech has worked, you should be able to click directly on the link to evaluation on screen. If it's easier for some people, there's a QR code. So yes, you should be able to do that, but the link to the evaluation is also in the chat. Again, it's just feedback about the session that helps us understand what's been useful and what else would have been useful for people. And I'll just pop back to the previous slide, because again, this link on this slide you should be able to click directly onto from your screen, but if not, okay, I don't know what's going on with that evaluation then. Hang on, let me just go in and find that. Hang on, okay, bear with me, I'm getting another link for the evaluation. Let's try this one. Always when you think you've got the tech sorted, it all goes a bit wrong, right? So I'm just putting another link in. This is the evaluation. If someone could test it and let me know, it might be that the one on screen,
the QR code, Natalie, the QR code was definitely working from phones.
Yeah, and so the QR code is here if that's easier from phones, and the link in the chat, just ignore this one on the screen. I must have put the wrong one in, sorry. Trying to be too clever with the tech. Okay, so there's another hand up, but it's not showing me whose name that is. Just bear with me while
it's just oh,
it's Yona still. Yeah, no worries. If there's another question, Yona, let me know, or pop it in the chat. And information about resources in Bristol. Colleagues in Bristol have a slightly different group and work. We can get that information in the email that goes out after the webinar as well. I'll just see if I can have a quick look now. But yeah, we have a couple more minutes for questions, if there's anything else. My Teams screen has frozen, so I'm relying on Nikki to let me know if there's any questions in the chat.
No.
Okay, well, I found the Bristol information. So I'm just going to pop a link into the chat about suicide prevention work in Bristol.
I just say we do all meet regionally, so we have a because this comes under the banner of what we call public mental health. So when Natalie and I aren't working on suicide prevention, the fluffy side is all the what we do to maintain good well-being. So Connect 5 ways to well-being, and we meet as a region regularly. So we are sort of talking to colleagues across the southwest, and likewise with our real-time surveillance as well. We meet our colleagues across the southwest to talk about that, and actually there is some attempt at a national real-time surveillance system as well being established by OHID, and as I said, that just means that we start to have an idea of what's happening across the piece before it actually, before we get to the without having to wait for the coroner. So yeah, we work really, we think, we try and share best practice across the region with each other, and even nationally. So there's a really good organisation called the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, and we're members of that, and so that enables us to get, and I think the woman that was interested going, but that that there's just loads of resources on there. We share like all the work that we're doing. Everyone's very generous in the world of suicide prevention in terms of sharing work, allowing everyone to copy their ideas. There's no competition. Everybody's quite passionate about saving lives. So yeah, it's a good community.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know I've looked at the evaluation and it shouldn't prevent anyone, it should be open to everyone, but I think Claire said she'll resend the evaluation and pledges link out with the slides and resource pack. So yes, I don't know quite what's occurred there, because yeah, some people seem to be able to, some people can't. If there's no more questions, my team screen is frozen again, sorry, then I think we can draw to a close. Thanks so much.
I just pop in?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Thanks,
It's
Claire.
Becca. Hi. Just to say, we are aware that there are a few glitches with the evaluation. We seem to have a couple of bits that where some of the questions are showing as blank. We'll send out all of the information in an email to you all early next week with a proper evaluation in, because we'd love to know your thoughts just as much as we would love to know what your pledges are from today. I just wanted to thank Nicola and Natalie for all of the work that they do on this topic, and also all of the preparation for today, delivering for us on behalf of the Community Safety Partnership. I want to thank you for that. It's been a really informative and fascinating presentation, but it hasn't just given information, it's given people direction in how to take an active part in tackling this issue in our community. So I want to do a massive thank you to both of you for your work and for your contributions today. We will be sending out the other information, and thank you to everybody who's joined today. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Becca. That's really appreciated.
And just another plug, there's lots of free training available, so please do use it. And also we have thousands of these, so if anyone can think of, oh, I know somewhere where it would be good to have some of these, then just give us a shout and we can break our business team by getting them sent out to you.
And also, Becca and Claire, if when you send that information out, I think we've neglected to actually put our email addresses on the slide set. So if you want to include our email addresses, that's fine. We're really happy for people to approach us.
Absolutely.
And yeah, the final message, again, as we said at the beginning, and as we have said through the session, taking care of ourselves is really important. And so, you know, you never quite know when things might affect you or impact you, and thinking, you know, even if you're feeling okay now, sometimes things can kind of come back at later moments. And any conversation, any discussion around people in distress, suicide, attempted suicide, it can be really, really tough. So please take care of yourselves. There are, you know, the crisis information is in the chat, and then when you get the resource pack, there's other information there. So yeah, please do take care of yourselves, because you are such an important resource out in communities and services, and you have to look after you too. So yeah, I think we might be done, and 3 minutes early, which is always good. But yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Just hanging on in case Becca or Claire want anything.
Yeah. I like the way that Becca and I are like, obviously